This week on Africa Update, African diplomats concern over regional security, safety of diasporas as Russia invade Ukraine. Ethiopia starts electricity production at Nile Mega Dam. About 60 killed in a blast at informal gold mine. Plus, Ugandans to face fines, jail for refusing COVID jab under new law. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Africa Update, where we review stories from across the continent. I am Ayuba. As diplomats around the world continue to react to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, concerns about the implication of the crisis on Africa and Africans in the diaspora has now come to the fore. In this report, Nigeria's former ambassador to the Soviet Union, Jibrin Dada Chinade, and Director of Political Affairs, ECOWAS, Aderemi Ajibewa, expressed concern over the safety of Nigerians in Russia and the possible proliferation of arms and mercenaries amidst the rising coups in the continent. Take a look. The world is in the wake of a devastating pandemic, and a possible third world war is knocking at the door. With the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the European Union, Britain, United States and its allies have unleashed sanctions that could see both sides suffer huge economical consequences and by extension the world at large.
Peace on our continent has been shattered.
But even more devastating will be the possible intervention of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, an intergovernmental military alliance of European countries, the United States and Canada. While economic impact may not be direct on Africa, stakeholders say there could be security implications, as seen in the case of Gaddafi regime in Libya.
The effect of all this is that, one, there might be, if there is a war, if it culminated into war, there's the tendency that we might have the ripple effect, just like we had the ripple effect in the 80s and 90s in West Africa here. You will see that most of the private military companies and the private mercenaries, there will be a sort of repercussion when the war finishes there. All those equipment that they were using, the war instrument and other things, as well as the personnel, they will want to shift to places like Mali, places like Sudan and other areas. We've witnessed it just like in the case of Libya. After the war, we had a problem here. So the two areas is in the militarization of the West African zone as well. And then there will be what we call the mercenaries, the presence of mercenaries here, and then the private military companies, and then we could see all forms of arms transfer being here, all the arms that are used.
With countries evacuating their citizens from Russia, there is uncertainty over the fate of Nigerians and some Africans in Ukraine and Russia. While the Nigerian government says arrangement is being made for special flight operations to evacuate an estimated 12,000 Nigerians in Ukraine, the question of safety remains unclear amidst the bombardment of military installations and some airports.
Ukraine is so far away from Nigeria. To bring in this huge number of students will be abated entirely. The government could initiate measures either to move, if necessary, Nigerian nationalities or Nigerian community either from Ukraine to the neighboring states where we feel we can house them. But to bring them to Nigeria, I believe the panic is there, all right, but I believe this withdrawal or asking people to move is part of the Western strategy of diplomacy.
Russia has insisted the only condition for diplomatic engagement is for Ukraine to withdraw its interest in joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which it considers a threat in the neighborhood.
One of the conditions of President Putin as a result of this dialogue and negotiations going on between Russia and the West and NATO was that there must be a discussion to assess Russian security interest. The Warsaw Pact has been disbanded since 1997. So there is no Warsaw Pact that was confronting the NATO Pact. The Warsaw Pact was led by Russia. NATO was led by America. Now, since the Russians have disbanded their own defense system, they were expecting the Americans at least to hold on to what they had before. In fact, one of the agreements reached between President Gorbachev and President Bush at the time, I was in Moscow, was that NATO will not expand to the West, but they have done so now. And I think it's going to be a very difficult diplomatic discussion.
After recognizing the two separatist states in the eastern Ukraine as independent, Vladimir Putin has launched what he calls special military operations targeting military bases in Ukraine, a move considered a violation of the Minsk Agreement and United Nations Charter, to be met with very heavy sanctions. Meanwhile, Russia's move to recognize breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine as republics drew a sharp rebuke from Kenyan UN Ambassador Martin Kimani, who used a speech at the UN Security Council to recount the perils of clinging to vestiges of empire. Kimani said Russian President Vladimir Putin rejected diplomacy in favor of military force, which has put the international norm of multilateralism on its deathbed. He warned Russia to respect its border with Ukraine, using Africa's colonial past to highlight the dangers of stoking the embers of dead empires.
Mr. President, this situation echoes our history. Kenya and almost every African country was birthed by the ending of empire. Our borders were not of our own drawing. They were drawn in the distant colonial metropoles of London, Paris, and Lisbon, with no regard for the ancient nations that they cleaved apart. Today, across the border of every single African country live our countrymen with whom we share deep historical, cultural, and linguistic bonds. At independence, had we chosen to pursue states on the basis of ethnic, racial, or religious homogeneity, we would still be waging bloody wars these many decades later. Instead, we agreed that we would settle for the borders that we inherited, but we would still pursue continental political, economic, and legal integration. Rather than form nations that looked ever backwards into history with a dangerous nostalgia, we chose to look forward to a greatness none of our many nations and peoples had ever known. We chose to follow the rules of the Organization of African Unity and the United Nations Charter, not because our borders satisfied us, but because we wanted something greater, forged in peace. We believe that all states formed from empires that have collapsed or retreated have many peoples in them yearning for integration with peoples in neighboring states. This is normal and understandable. After all, who does not want to be joined to their brethren and to make common purpose with them? However, Kenya rejects such a yearning from being pursued by force. We must complete our recovery from the embers of dead empires in a way that does not plunge us back into new forms of domination and oppression. We rejected irredentism and expansionism on any basis, including racial, ethnic, religious, or cultural factors. We reject it again today.
Now, the United States and Egypt launched a joint work group to prepare for the next UN Climate Change Summit, which the Middle Eastern country will host in November, the American envoy for climate said. U.S. envoy John Kerry said the group's main task is working on the COP27 conference in Egypt's Red Sea resort of Sharm el-Sheikh. He said Egypt has already taken many steps in the preparation for the summit. Kerry said other world tensions, including the ongoing Ukraine crisis, does not change the reality of what is happening every day with respect to the climate. He spoke at a news conference in Cairo along with Egyptian Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry. Neither official took questions from reporters. Now, the Zimbabwean government has welcomed the decision of the European Union to lift travel and financial sanctions imposed on Vice President Constantino Chiwenga, former First Lady Grace Mugabe, and military chief Valerio Sibanda. The EU took the decision despite acknowledging that Zimbabwe's human rights record had not improved and has the potential of getting worse. The sanctions were first imposed on them 20 years ago, but were suspended 2 years ago. They have now been completely removed. However, sanctions against Zimbabwe's defense industry remain in place. Zimbabwean government spokesman Nick Mangwana says the decision is a positive indication of the positive relationship with the EU. The government will continue pushing for all sanctions to be removed unconditionally, he added. President Emerson Mnangagwa has been trying to improve relations with Western nations since ousting long-serving ruler Robert Mugabe in 2017. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan was welcomed with an official ceremony in the Congolese capital, Kinshasa, where he arrived as the first stop of his 4-day African tour. Erdogan was initially welcomed in Kinshasa International Airport in the capital by senior Congolese officials, including Prime Minister Jean-Michel Sama and the Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Christophe Lutundula and Turkey's ambassador in Kinshasa, Murat Ulku. After departing from the airport, Erdogan was welcomed with an official ceremony by his Congolese counterpart, Felix Tshisekedi, at the presidential palace. The 4-day Africa tour focused on all aspects of bilateral relations and opportunities for improving cooperation between Turkey and the host countries in all fields. Mali has taken legal action to get sanctions imposed by West Africa's monetary union lifted, lawyers for the country's ruling military junta said, as it battles a debt crisis that threatens to wreck the economy. Eight-nation Regional Monetary Authority, UEMOA, on January 9th told all financial institutions under its umbrella to suspend Mali with immediate effect after the junta, which overthrew the president in a coup in 2020, reneged on a promise to hold early elections. The UEMOA action severed Mali's access to regional financial markets and was taken in conjunction with sanctions imposed by the Economic Community of West African States, which froze Malian states' assets, closed its borders, and suspended non-essential financial transactions. The junta's lawyers said they filed two complaints on February 15th with the UEMOA Court of Justice. You're watching Africa Update on Trust Television. Coming up shortly. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed inaugurated electricity production from the country's mega dam on the Blue Nile, a milestone in the controversial multi-billion-dollar project. Details coming after the break. Thanks for staying. Here's a look at the top stories again. African diplomats concern over regional security, safety of diasporas as Russia invade Ukraine. Ethiopia starts electricity production at Nile mega dam. Moving on, the used tires and plastic containers that litter the back streets of cities and towns in Zambia might be an eyesore. But for one company, they are also an opportunity to make fuel that could slash the nation's energy import bill while cleaning up its trash. The project by Zambia's Central African Renewable Energy Corps currently processes 1.5 tons of waste to make 600 to 700 liters of diesel and gasoline per day on a pilot basis. That's hardly enough to dent the country's mountains of rubbish or its $1.4 billion annual fuel import bill for the 140 million liters of petrol a day it consumes. But for Chief Executive Mulenga, it's the start of something bigger. The company is seeking $60 million in investment to raise daily fuel output to 400 tons of diesel, 125 tons of petrol, and 30 tons of liquefied petroleum gas. He said all at roughly half the cost of imported fuel. Thousands of Senegalese gathered on Tuesday for the inauguration of a 50,000-seater stadium aimed at making the country Africa's go-to venue for international events. The stadium is in Diamniadio, a town being built about 30 kilometers from the capital Dakar, for which an express train link opened in December. The venue, to be named in honor of former President Abdoulaye Wade, will be the only one in Senegal certified for international football. Current President Macky Sall said during an inauguration ceremony that the naming of the stadium was a tribute to the multi-dimensional intellectual Pan-Africanist politician. The country's last major stadium, Lat Dior, in the region of Thiès, 70 kilometers from Dakar, lost its certification from the Confederation of African Football in May last year. Now, Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed inaugurated electricity production from the country's mega dam on the Blue Nile, a milestone in the controversial multi-billion-dollar project. Abiy, accompanied by high-ranking officials, toured the power generation station and pressed a series of buttons on an electronic screen, a move that officials said initiated production. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is set to be the largest hydroelectric scheme in Africa, but has been at the center of a regional dispute ever since work first began in 2011. Ethiopia's downstream neighbors, Egypt and Sudan, view it as a threat because of their dependence on Nile waters, while Addis Ababa deems it essential for its electrification and development. The $4.2 billion project is ultimately expected to produce more than 5,000 megawatts of electricity, more than doubling Ethiopia's electricity output. Still, the Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed opened the door for negotiations with rebel groups in the country. Abiy was speaking to the members of parliament on Tuesday and further indicated that there have been no negotiations so far, but he is open for any future talks with the Tigrayan leaders. He further stressed that there will be no negotiation against the national interests of Ethiopia. Ethiopian federal forces have been fighting rebels loyal to the Tigray People's Liberation Front since November 2020. The country is also messed in a border row with Sudan and a dispute with Egypt and Khartoum over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam on the Blue Nile River. Libya's parliament said it will hold a session next week in which it is likely to vote on confirming a new interim government, though the incumbent administration has vowed it will not hand over power. A year after a unity government was installed in Tripoli and 2 months after a scheduled election was cancelled amid arguments over the rules, the dispute over how to move forward threatens to plunge Libya back into division. Former Interior Minister Fatih Bashaga, the man designated by the parliament to form the new government, said on Thursday he was ready to propose a cabinet, and the chamber's spokesman said a session will be held on Monday. However, the current Prime Minister, Abdelhamid Al-Deba, who took office through a UN-backed process, has said he will only hand over power after an election, and this week said he was planning to hold a nationwide vote in the summer. The parliament accuses Deba of corruption and says his term expired on December 24th, when the election was meant to happen. President Uhuru Kenyatta officially endorsed longtime rival Raila Odinga during an address before his Jubilee Party supporters on Wednesday. President Uhuru Kenyatta said Raila Odinga meant well for the country. President Kenyatta urged leaders from central Kenya to cast their ballot for 77-year-old Odinga. Presidential elections are set for August 9. It will be the 5th time Mr. Odinga runs for president. The president's endorsement for Raila Odinga further isolates Deputy President William Ruto, who will run as the United Democratic Alliance nominee. Now, on a sad note, more than 60 people were killed and dozens more wounded in an explosion at an informal gold mining site in southwest Burkina Faso, state television reported, citing local officials. The cause of the explosion in Pony province was not yet known. Pony's High Commissioner, Antoine Douamba, told state television. It was not clear exactly what kind of gold mining went on at the site. Burkina Faso is home to some major gold mines run by international companies, but also to hundreds of smaller informal sites that operate without oversight or regulation. Children frequently work in these so-called artisanal mines. Accidents are common. Uganda plans to impose fines on people who refuse to be vaccinated against COVID-19, and those who fail to pay could be sent to prison under a new public health law, which lawmakers are scrutinizing, Parliament said. Although the East African country started administering COVID-19 jabs nearly a year ago, only about 16 million jabs have been administered in a population of 45 million, with officials blaming widespread reluctance for the low coverage. Parliament's House Health Committee has begun scrutinizing Public Health Bill 2021, which seeks to make coronavirus vaccinations mandatory. The new law proposes a fine of 4 million Ugandan shillings for those who fail to get vaccinated or receive a jail term of 6 months, Parliament said in a statement on its website. Sudan has released its 115 of some 135 anti-coup protesters who had been held for weeks, a UN official said on Thursday, following pressure from lawyers, families, and the international community. The detainees are part of a protest movement against an October 25th coup that has persisted despite security crackdowns, killing 82 and wounding more than 2,000, according to medics. Adama Dieng, the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, designated expert for Sudan, called for immediate release of all the other protesters. Lawyers say the detainees include protesters, members of neighborhood resistance committees, UN members, and politicians, some arrested during protests and others taken from their homes and other locations. Still imprisoned are top former officials under the civilian-military power-sharing arrangement prior to the coup, held on corruption charges, as well as protesters accused of killing a police brigadier general. And with that, we wrap up Africa Update for this week. Join us again next week for another edition of the program. Connect with us via our social media platforms and also subscribe to our YouTube channel to watch us live. I am Ayuba Ilia. Thank you for watching.